Picture the spring of 1843 on the banks of the Missouri River. Independence is buried under wagons, canvas tops bleached pale in the sun, nearly 1,000 of them crowded along the square and spilling into the surrounding fields and creek bottoms. Oxen bawl in their yokes. Children dart between wheel spokes while their mothers count flour sacks, dried beans, and bacon rinds, and their fathers argue with the men chosen to lead the column about the order of march and who gets first pick of the river fords. Blacksmiths work through the night resetting iron tires that have already loosened in the spring heat, and preachers hold one last service on the courthouse lawn before the whole town of Wagons rolls out, praying over families who mostly know each other only by the reputation that spread through camp in the last few weeks of waiting. This is the jumping-off point, the last town with a store and a doctor before more than 2,000 miles of prairie grass, river crossing, mountain pass, and high desert. Merchants along the square are doing the best business of their year, selling flour, bacon, coffee, and the heavy iron kettles no family thinks to leave behind until the third week on the trail, when the same families start dumping them on the roadside to save weight. Men who have never driven an ox team in their lives are buying teams anyway, on the advice of neighbors who crossed the year before and came back with stories instead of fortunes. When the lead wagons finally pull free of the mud in May, the train stretches for miles behind them, a slow-moving town on wheels, carrying close to 1,000 people toward a country most of them have never seen and can barely picture. Historians would later call 1843 the year the Oregon Trail was proven, the season that turned a rumor passed around in newspapers and church pews into an actual, walkable road. Riding inside those wagons, folded into family Bibles and stitched into the linings of trunks, were the names that would fill the Willamette Valley and everything west of it for generations. Some of those names are still common across the Pacific Northwest today. A few of them built towns that still carry their signatures on a road sign or a county map. And if your family has roots running back to Missouri, Iowa, Illinois, or the Ohio Valley in the 1840s, there is a real chance one of these 10 names belongs to you. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The wagons that rolled out of Independence in 1843 did not appear from nowhere. 2 years earlier, in 1841, a small party led by John Bidwell and John Bartleson had proven that ordinary families with ordinary wagons could cross the continent at all, though barely, since they abandoned their wagons in what is now Nevada and finished the trip on foot and on horseback, eating what they could shoot or trade for along the way. Missionaries had already scouted pieces of the route before that. Marcus and Narcissa Whitman rode west in 1836 to build a mission near what is now Walla Walla, and Narcissa became one of the first white women known to cross the Rocky Mountains overland, a fact that newspapers back east printed and reprinted as proof that the crossing was survivable for families, not just trappers and soldiers. Word from people like the Whitmans, along with newspaper accounts of Oregon's mild climate and open land, spread through the Mississippi Valley at almost the exact moment the Panic of 1837 had wiped out farms and banks across the country, leaving thousands of families with nothing left to lose by moving. Britain and the United States were also arguing over who actually owned the Oregon country, and filling it with American families was one way to settle that argument without firing a shot. By the 1844 election, the boundary dispute had become a campaign slogan, 54-40 or fight, though the treaty that followed 2 years later split the difference well short of that line and settled the border along the 49th parallel. Over the next 2.5 decades, something close to 80,000 people made the same crossing that 1843 wagon train did, most of them walking beside the wagons rather than riding in them, since the beds were packed with flour, bacon, tools, seed corn, and whatever single piece of furniture a family refused to leave behind. A wagon that started the trip loaded with 4,000 pounds of goods was routinely half empty by South Pass, its excess weight simply abandoned along the roadside for the next family to pick through. The route followed the Platte River through what is now Nebraska, a river famously described as too thick to drink and too thin to plow, climbed through South Pass in Wyoming so gradually that most travelers did not even notice they had crossed the Continental Divide, dropped down to Fort Hall to trade for fresh supplies, and then turned brutal. The Snake River Canyon tore up wagon wheels and left families rationing water within sight of a river they could not safely reach. The Blue Mountains of eastern Oregon exhausted oxen that had already walked more than 1,500 miles on worn hooves. Cholera swept through the earlier wagon trains of the late 1840s and early 1850s with a speed that terrified everyone who saw it, killing a healthy adult within a day of the first symptoms and leaving graves scattered every few hundred yards along some stretches of the trail, many of them dug shallow and fast so the train could keep moving before dark. The final stretch along the Columbia River killed people who had survived everything else. Families lashing their wagons to hastily built rafts and gambling on rapids that had already taken other families before them. A trip meant to take 4 months regularly stretched into 5 or 6, and every family that finished it left a name behind in a diary, a cemetery, or a town that still carries it on a road sign a century and a half later. Most trains organized themselves like small traveling governments, electing a captain, drafting simple bylaws about guard duty and the order of march, and holding informal courts to settle disputes over stolen livestock or broken promises long before any federal law reached that far west. Guidebooks, some accurate and some dangerously wrong, circulated widely enough that families argued over which author to trust the way people today argue over which map application to believe. Encounters with native nations along the route, the Pawnee, the Sioux, the Shoshone, and the Cayuse among them, were far more often trade than conflict, with emigrants swapping cloth, tools, and worn-out horses for fresh ones, fish, and safe passage through tribal land, though the balance of that relationship would shift hard by the end of the 1840s as more wagons came through and more grass and game disappeared with them. Every one of the 10 names on this list crossed through that same mix of order and improvisation, trade and danger, in the years before the trail was ever a paved highway or a national park. Letters written home from the trail describe long stretches of pure monotony, mile after mile of sagebrush and dust, broken up by sudden crises that families had no way to prepare for, a wagon axle snapping in the middle of a river ford, a child wandering off during a buffalo hunt, a sudden hailstorm flattening tents in the middle of the night. It was a slow, grinding kind of hardship rather than a dramatic one, and most families who wrote about it afterward remembered the boredom and the exhaustion as vividly as any single dangerous moment. Number 10. Bidwell. John Bidwell was barely 21 when he helped organize the Western Emigration Society back in Missouri, the group that became the Bartleston-Bidwell Party of 1841, the very first party of American settlers to attempt the overland crossing with the explicit goal of reaching California and Oregon by wagon. They set out with no real guide and no certainty the crossing was even possible for families rather than trappers, and by the time they reached the deserts of what is now Nevada, they had lost the trail so completely that they burned or buried their wagons and walked the rest of the way, some on foot, some clinging to the backs of failing oxen. Bidwell's party split near what is now southern Idaho, roughly half turning toward Oregon and the other half pushing on toward California, and Bidwell himself went south with the California group, later becoming a wealthy rancher and eventually a member of Congress. But the road his group carved out through the Rockies became the skeleton that every Oregon-bound wagon train after them would follow, widen, and improve year after year. The party of roughly 32 people included Nancy Kelsey, who crossed with an infant daughter in her arms and became one of the first American women known to reach California overland, walking barefoot over the Sierra Nevada in the final stretch after her shoes wore through completely. Bidwell Park in Chico, California, one of the largest municipal parks in the country, still carries his name today, a long way from the muddy Missouri riverbank where his gamble began. Number 9. Nesmith. James W. Nesmith was elected captain of the 1843 Wagon Trains Mounted Rifle Company, the men responsible for scouting ahead, guarding the herds at night, and keeping order among nearly 1,000 strangers thrown together for a 5-month walk across country none of them had seen before. He had almost no money and almost no formal education when he left Missouri that spring, and he arrived in Oregon with little more than the clothes on his back and a reputation for keeping his head in a crisis. Each morning it fell to Nesmith and his company to ride the flanks of the slow-moving column, watching for stray cattle, broken axles, and the hunting parties from tribes whose land the wagons were passing through, while the rest of the train fell into its assigned order behind him. Within a few years he was a judge, then a militia officer during the Cayuse War that followed the Whitman killings, and by 1861 he was sitting in the United States Senate representing the very state his wagon train had helped settle less than 2 decades earlier. The small community of Nesmith, Oregon, in Polk County still bears his name today, a quiet reminder that a young man who crossed the plains as a captain of scouts came home a lawmaker. Number 8. Barlow. Samuel Barlow reached the Dalles in the fall of 1845 with his family and looked hard at the alternative every emigrant dreaded, floating an entire loaded wagon on a homemade raft down the Columbia River rapids, and decided flatly that there had to be a better way to finish the trip. He and a small crew of volunteers spent that first winter and the following summer hacking a rough wagon road around the south side of Mount Hood, cutting through dense old-growth timber and loose volcanic ash with hand tools and sheer stubbornness. By 1846, the Barlow Road was open as a toll route, charging $5 a wagon and 10 cents a head of livestock at a time when that was real money for a family that had already spent everything getting that far. It was miserable, steep, and expensive, but it was dry ground instead of whitewater, and thousands of families chose the toll gate over the river rapids in the years that followed. The road stayed in private hands, changing owners and toll rates several times until the state of Oregon finally purchased it outright in the early 20th century and opened it free of charge. The town of Barlow, Oregon sits near the road's western end today, and hikers still walk long sections of the original route through what is now the Mount Hood National Forest. Number 7. Sager. Henry and Naomi Sager set out for Oregon in 1844 with 7 children in tow, the youngest still a nursing infant, and neither parent survived the trip. Henry died of a fever partway across the plains, and Naomi, worn down by grief and the trail itself, died only weeks later, leaving the 7 children to finish the crossing in the wagons, and under the care of other families in the train who had no obligation to take them in, but did anyway. When the orphaned Sagers finally reached the Whitman mission at Wailatpu that autumn, Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, who had no surviving children of their own, took all 7 into their household without hesitation. 3 years later, when Cayuse warriors attacked the mission in the aftermath of a measles outbreak that had devastated native families while sparing most of the vaccinated settlers around them, several of the Sager children were present in the mission house. Catherine Sager, one of the older girls, survived the attack and later, as an adult, wrote one of the only detailed first-hand accounts of what actually happened at Wailatpu that day, a document historians still rely on for the events that neither the newspapers nor the official inquiries fully captured. After the massacre, the surviving Sager girls were held for several weeks along with other mission survivors before being ransomed and released, and most of them went on to live long lives in Oregon, marrying into other pioneer families whose names still turn up on Willamette Valley land deeds and cemetery records today. The Sager name did not found a town or sit in a state legislature, but it survived one of the hardest true stories the entire trail ever produced. Number 6. Meek. Joe Meek had already spent more than a decade as a fur trapper and mountain man in the Rocky Wilderness before he settled in the Willamette Valley in the early 1840s, and he brought a mountain man's bluntness and total lack of patience into a room full of cautious farmers trying to decide whether Oregon needed any kind of formal government at all. At the Champaign meeting of May 1843, the very same spring the great wagon train left Missouri 2,000 miles to the east, local settlers voted on whether to organize a provisional government, and by most pioneer accounts the vote was too close to call by voice alone. Meek reportedly stepped forward and called for the crowd to physically divide and line up on opposite sides of the field, and the head count that followed settled the matter by a margin of only a few men. Oregon got its first American-style government that day by a narrow margin. Meek's own daughter, Helen Marr, was living at the Whitman mission when the Cayuse attacked in 1847, and her death in that attack pushed Meek to ride east alone through winter snow, at real personal risk, to ask Congress in person to finally make Oregon an official territory. He later became the first United States Marshal of the Oregon Territory he had helped bring into being. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Number 5. Applegate. Jesse Applegate led what came to be called the cow column during the 1843 migration, a separate division of the wagon train built specifically to move several thousand head of loose cattle without letting them trample the families and wagons walking ahead of them. He later wrote a detailed memoir of that crossing, titled A Day with the Cow Column in 1843, that remains one of the clearest first-hand descriptions historians have of how a wagon train actually organized its day, from the bugle call that woke the camp before sunrise to the exact order the wagons fell into on the trail each morning. The memoir describes families finishing their herding, milking, and hitching before 7 and the whole column back in motion by 8. A level of discipline Applegate credited with getting his division through the season without a single serious clash with the tribes whose land they crossed. 3 years later, in 1846, Jesse and his brother Lindsay scouted a southern alternate route meant to avoid the deadly Columbia River rafting altogether, a path that came to be known as the Applegate Trail. It was slower, drier, and far rougher than the brothers had promised, and more than one family who chose it that first season regretted the decision long before they reached the Cascades. The Applegate Valley and the Applegate River in southern Oregon still carry the family name on modern maps. Number 4. Donner. The Donner name belongs to California history more than Oregon history in the strictest sense, but the two trails were the exact same road for most of the distance, and the split between them is precisely what makes this story worth telling here. In 1846, the Donner and Reed families reached Fort Bridger in Wyoming, where a promoter named Lansford Hastings was loudly advertising an untested shortcut he claimed would save hundreds of miles off the standard route. Most of the wagon trains ahead of them that season heard the same pitch and ignored it, choosing to continue on the proven road toward Fort Hall, the same well-worn stretch the Oregon-bound trains had been using for years without serious incident. The Donner Party took the shortcut instead. It cost them several critical weeks in the Wasatch Mountains and the Nevada desert, weeks they simply did not have left to spare, and by the time they finally reached the Sierra Nevada, an early winter storm had already sealed the mountain passes behind them. Of the roughly 87 people trapped in the snow that winter, nearly half died of starvation and exposure over the following months, and some of the survivors resorted to eating the flesh of those who had already died in order to stay alive until rescue parties could reach them in the spring. Rescue teams reached the survivors in stages over several months, and James Reed, who had been banished from the party earlier that year after a roadside fight that left another man dead, was among those who returned to help lead one of the rescue parties back into the mountains. The tragedy became a permanent, widely told warning up and down the trail for the rest of its active years, proof that the marked and proven road, however slow and however tempting a shortcut looked on a stranger's map, was almost always the safer choice. Number 3. Night. Amelia Stewart Knight crossed the plains in 1853 with her husband and 7 children, and she was pregnant with an 8th for essentially the entire 5-month journey. Her trail diary, written in exhausted, clipped entries most nights by firelight, is one of the most detailed accounts historians have from a woman on the Oregon Trail, recording washed-out river crossings, sudden hailstorms that shredded the wagon covers, and the endless daily labor of cooking, washing, and tending small children for a family of 9, with almost no clean water to spare for anything beyond drinking. Near the very end of the journey, only days after the family finally reached Oregon soil in the fall of 1853, Amelia gave birth to her 8th child. Her diary does not dwell on the moment for more than a line or two, moving on almost immediately to describe the next day's chores and the state of the wagon, a detail historians have pointed to again and again as one of the clearest windows into how ordinary the extraordinary had become for the women who made this crossing. Her journal was later published as part of the Covered Wagon Women collection of pioneer writings, sitting alongside dozens of similar diaries that together give historians one of the fullest pictures available of what the trail actually felt like from inside a wagon seat, rather than from behind a rifle or a survey map. Number 2. Thornton. J. Quinn Thornton left Missouri in 1846 and, like the Donner Party that very same season, was persuaded to try a southern cutoff rather than stick to the standard route, though his group was aiming for the Willamette Valley rather than California. The detour led his wagon train into the Umpqua Canyon in southern Oregon, a stretch of country so rugged and thickly timbered that the party eventually abandoned their wagons entirely and packed out whatever they could carry on the backs of half-starved oxen, arriving in the settled valley in a state close to total collapse, months behind schedule, and with almost nothing left. Thornton survived the ordeal to become one of Oregon's first Supreme Court justices and later helped draft parts of the state's constitution. His own detailed written account of the crossing, along with the interviews he later conducted with survivors of the Donner Party itself, became one of the first widely read books to describe that tragedy for readers across the country, which meant the same man who barely survived his own southern shortcut ended up introducing the Donner story to the nation. Number 1. Whitman. No single name is tied more tightly to the Oregon Trail than Whitman. Marcus and Narcissa Whitman were not among the wagon train families themselves. They had arrived years earlier as missionaries, but their mission station at Wailatpu became a landmark, a way station, and eventually a symbol for nearly every wagon train that followed them west, including the orphaned Sager children they took in without a second thought. For more than a decade, the Whitmans represented the promise the trail itself was selling to families back in Missouri and Iowa, that a Christian American Oregon was not just some distant possibility, but already underway, already being built one mission and one wagon train at a time. That promise ended abruptly on the 29th of November 1847, when Cayuse men, whose own families had just watched a measles epidemic kill their children while the vaccinated settlers living around them largely survived, attacked the mission and killed the Whitmans along with several others living there. The killings triggered the Cayuse War, and 5 Cayuse men were eventually tried and executed in Oregon City in 1850 for their role in the attack, a trial many historians today consider deeply unfair given the pressure the entire Cayuse Nation was already facing. The mission site itself is preserved now as the Whitman Mission National Historic Site, just outside Walla Walla, Washington. The killings also finally convinced a reluctant Congress that Oregon needed to become an official United States territory, which it did the following year. A name that began the decade as a symbol of the trail's promise ended it as the reason the federal government finally decided to take the whole enterprise seriously. What ties all 10 of these names together is not just where they traveled, but what happened after they finally stopped traveling. The families who reached the Willamette Valley tended to marry within the same small circle of overland arrivals for a generation or more, simply because there was almost no one else nearby to marry for years after they arrived. Church rolls, land claim records, and county histories from Marion, Polk, and Yamhill counties in the 1850s and 60s show the same handful of trail surnames appearing again and again as parents, in-laws, and witnesses on each other's documents. Population geneticists have documented broadly similar patterns in other tightly bound migrant communities around the world, from French settlers in Quebec to Dutch settlers in South Africa, where a small founding group that marries mostly within itself for several generations tends to leave behind a genetic signature that stays sharper and more concentrated than it would in a larger, more freely mixed population. Groups like the Sons and Daughters of Oregon Pioneers, which still requires documented proof of an ancestor who arrived in the territory before Oregon achieved statehood in 1859, exist precisely because so many families in the Willamette Valley can trace their line back through this exact narrow window of wagon trains and no further. None of this means anyone with roots in Western Oregon is somehow purer or more original than anyone else, since every one of these founding families was itself a mix of English, Scottish, Irish, and German lines already blended together long before they ever reached Missouri. What it does mean is that the mixing mostly stopped for a generation or two once these particular families reached the valley, sealed in by mountains on 3 sides and an ocean on the 4th, which is exactly the kind of geographic isolation that tends to leave a genetic record easier to trace than in a population that kept absorbing new arrivals every decade. If your own family history runs back through Missouri, Iowa, or the Ohio Valley in the 1840s, 50s, or 60s, and if it eventually lands somewhere in Western Oregon, there is a real chance you are looking at one of these 10 names, or at the very least a name that traveled beside them in the same slow column of wagons. The wagon era itself did not last much longer than a single working lifetime. By 1869, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad meant a trip that had once taken a healthy family 5 hard months on foot could be finished in about a week from a padded seat, and within a few years the great wagon trains had thinned from thousands of people a season to almost none. The ruts those wagons cut into solid rock at places like Guernsey, Wyoming are still visible today, worn several feet deep by wheels that passed over the same soft sandstone year after year, and they remain one of the few physical marks left by a migration that otherwise passed through the landscape without paving a single mile of road. The names lasted where the ruts did not, carried forward in family Bibles, county courthouses, and the same small Willamette Valley churches where so many of these families first met each other as strangers finishing the hardest walk of their lives. Bidwell scouted a road nobody was even sure existed. Nesmith kept order on the trail and later kept the peace in Washington. Barlow cut a path around the mountain rather than trust his family to the river. The Sager children survived their own parents, only to be caught up in a tragedy at the very mission that had taken them in. Meek helped vote a government into being with a handful of votes, and then rode through winter snow to defend it in person. Applegate mapped an alternate road and left his name on a whole valley behind him. The Donners paid the ultimate price for trusting an unproven shortcut over the known road. Night kept riding through an exhaustion most of us can barely imagine today. Thornton walked out of a canyon that nearly killed his entire party and went on to help write a state's laws. And Whitman became the single name that turned a quiet mission station into a national cause. 10 names, 1 long road, and a country that still carries every one of them, whether it remembers where the road actually started or not. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.